This is Evelyn Lopez. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear, the Earth911.com podcast for the week of May 13th, 2019. We're recording at the very famous Moonyard Recording Studio in Tacoma, Washington.
Home of 3 stars of bands. 3
bands record out of this studio. I'm not kidding. So there are a lot of changes occurring in the recycling industry. You've probably seen some of these at your home if you've got curbside recycling, or you may have read about it in the newspaper. Some of this is due to changes in overseas markets. Some of this is due to issues closer to home. So we thought, well, we'd talk about that today. Talk about how the industry is faring and what issues to watch out for. And today, I've got to tell you, we're having a few technological issues of our own. So we have our Earth911 publisher, Mitch Ratcliffe. Mitch, where are you coming from today?
My beautiful home office in Lakewood, Washington.
Very good. And I am sitting in my dining room that I have a 1-foot square space of open dining room table. And the rest is covered with vintage cameras and lenses.
Nice.
Yeah, very nice. A little dusty. One of our Earth911 writers, Sarah Lozanova, usually joins us for this podcast, and I hope she will be, but she's having some computer issues this morning. So we thought we'd talk first about recycling industry, and particularly, Mitch, you've been working very closely with the Institute of Scrap Recycling
Institute for Scrap Recycling Industries, ISRI.
ISRI. And there's some challenges that are particular to them, and there's some challenges that I think are good things for all of us as consumers and recyclers to know about. But start us off.
Yeah, and in fact, we are working to schedule Tony Scott, who's the Director of Safety Practices at ISRI, to join us to talk about safety issues generally, and we'll be talking about that a bit today. ISRI is an industry research and lobbying organization, as well as a network for developing your business in recycling. So if you're interested in starting a recycling business, you should definitely check out ISRI.org for information about what's going on in the industry, pricing. It's worthwhile to join the organization, and in fact, Earth911 is a member as well. And as such, we have recently sponsored the Residential Recycling Symposium at the annual ISRI conference, where we talked about safety, about the changes in the recycling streams that are going on because of a variety of issues, which we'll get into. And we thought it'd be a good idea today to talk about safety generally, and particularly about thinking about what goes into your bin or into the drop-off programs that you're interacting with. So let's dig in.
Let's do that. Well, let's talk about one of the changes that I see everywhere, and I did some reviews of various newspapers, is a change in glass recycling. And I don't know if this is really tied into ISRI, but it appears that most cities and counties are, if they do curbside recycling of glass, are considering stopping that or changing it in some way. And it seems to be both an issue of money, as in, the revenue from glass is not that great, and that it's kind of difficult to work it in with your curbside because you don't want the glass getting into your rest of your recycling. But right. Also I think of safety, because glass is fragile and can cut people and create enormous problems.
Well, so you're absolutely right. It is about money. It's about money to pay for it in terms of the municipal programs being able to continue to collect this stuff, because the price paid for glass has collapsed since China stopped taking a lot of imports. And the result has been that a lot of glass is getting stockpiled. So there are warehouses full of glass out there. But there are also other issues that would make it easier for them, or other ways for them to make that easier to recycle. And the first would be if it was better separated, because different kinds of glass, that is, different chemical components of the glass, need to be handled differently, and different color glass needs to be melted separately in order to come back with that color glass again. And so we need to be better at sorting our materials, and we also need to make sure that we're not just dumping a bunch of broken glass into the recycling bin, because that's where people can get hurt. It can get stuck into cardboard, for instance, and then during the cardboard process, it's running along a conveyor belt. People are picking this stuff out. They can get cut pretty severely. That's part of the reason that we need to think about what we put into the curbside. But the very first thing we should do is separate the glass into different colors. And that makes it easier for somebody to make money with the recycling of the glass later in the process. So what we've always ignored as consumers around the world is the cost of getting rid of the stuff that we have used. And generally it's been treated as okay, well, if we can put it in the ground at the lowest possible cost, everything's fine. But in fact, that isn't the way we need to go, we've discovered, because we now produce so much more waste than we did, say, 2,000 years ago. When incidentally, the first commercial or municipal program was introduced in Rome.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, in about the same year that Julius Caesar was assassinated, they started collecting garbage in Rome. But
that's interesting.
We can't just shove this stuff in the ground for a variety of reasons, having to do with the environment, having to do with the ability to regulate and manage these sites once they're full. One of the things people don't realize is that the dump is actually an 11-year operation. You can only run a landfill for 11 years, no matter what percentage of it you fill, because you get a license and then you are agreeing to then manage that site for another 30 years afterwards, even though the stuff in the ground is going to last a lot longer. So, unfortunately, it's not a problem that we can just solve by throwing more money at it. It's really a matter of how do we take part in the sorting and preparation of all the waste that we produce, which is not even really waste if you treat it this way. It's all material that can be recycled.
All materials, all resources. In Tacoma, the change they're looking at, right now, you have a separate bin for glass, but it is mixed glass, and you put it out whenever it's full. So our recycling is picked up every other week, and sometimes there might be glass, and sometimes there might not be glass. And that's difficult for planning their labor costs because they don't know whether they're going to need, the people on the truck to pick up this. It's a small bin, so you pick it up. It's not automated. And what they're looking at is moving away from the curbside pickup of glass and setting up recycling stations around the city for you to bring your glass. And that would also have the advantage of people then, sorting their glass at that facility, so throwing the brown bottles in the brown bin. The question is, and the worry always is, will people do it, or will they throw their glass into the garbage?
Well, and the answer probably is that we should have a deposit system like used in Oregon, California, and other states. California in particular has recently introduced a new bottle bill that allows them to assign values to a variety of different types of materials, not just glass. And those incentives are shown to work. And what is interesting is what we're really doing is decentralizing the centralized waste management system. Our garbage platform is a mid-20th century invention to deal with massive amounts of newly created consumer waste. And it all went into one stream because in the industrial era, that was the most efficient way to do it. And we're finding that more distributed approaches to recycling could be potentially economically viable in ways that these centralized systems are not. In fact, I'd point to an article that's in the on the site this week about a styrofoam recycler who builds a trailer that has a styrofoam recycler on it. And so instead of sending all your styrofoam to one big central location where you've got a $350,000 machine, you've got this $40,000 machine that can drive around to where the styrofoam is, recycle it on the spot, and even pay out money potentially to the people who provided it. That's where you start to think about, okay, well, let's flip the whole system upside down. It's no longer centralized, distributed. A lot of the work is taking care of what is called the edges in current economic talk, because we have networks that connect everybody now. That's maybe where we want to be going in terms of overall collection of materials, but it's going to require that each of us as consumers start thinking about how we separate those materials a little bit more. And we may even end up earning money from it.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. If you can break the operations down to smaller pieces, then you have a lot more opportunity for small businesses and entrepreneurs to get involved, because, everything altogether is really too massive. It's going to be either a corporation doing your waste management type activity or a municipality. But if you have, like a specialized glass or the styrofoam you've mentioned, you might be able to get some individuals who can figure out a way to make a good profit off of that.
And ultimately, somebody has to make a living from doing this. We can't all volunteer our way to success. And that is why I believe we can use a business, not centric approach, but a business enabled approach to solve a lot of these problems that is more flexible. One of the other things that we see a lot, and this happens in our questions, our Earthling questions, is new products or materials are introduced and nobody knows how to recycle them. So photovoltaic cells, for instance, are only now beginning to be recycled. We've been making them for 30 years. Mm-hmm. And they last 30 years. So now the problem is starting to come home to roost. Mm-hmm. That's an industry in and of itself. There's a lot of material. The material is valuable enough that if it was collected in a systematic way, you could get the money back out of it, and it would be useful for all of us. We need to think about the whole economy that way. Where's a company basically just throwing up its hands and saying, we don't care what happens at the end of the life of our product? Well, those are companies that need to be held responsible for the end of the life of their product. In Europe, they've got producer responsibility laws that require, for instance, home appliance manufacturers and car makers to be prepared to recycle or take back their material at the end of their life. And then the other thing to think about, and this is a pressing issue for the United States, given our current foreign policy and trade issues, is keeping more of the material at home instead of, as we have, just shipping it overseas to other countries who essentially mine our waste for their next economy.
Well, I was thinking about that, Mitch. We have a story up on the website that is, I think, sponsored by IRSI. It's 2018 Ferrous Metal Recycling Sees Strong Growth. And it's about the fact that over the last year, metals that contain iron in them continue to be very lucrative for the scrap metal industry. So a lot of metals, and it's more efficient and cheaper to recycle metals into steel than to create new steel from scratch. And the thing that occurred to me was, so we're recycling all this metals, and you'll see them if you're anywhere near a scrapyard, big piles of sorted metals. But a lot of that gets sent overseas for processing and recycling. And then when we're building, a lot of our steel is also coming from overseas. So I know the economics are sort of not quite there, but it really seems like that's a potential area for a lot more in-country recycling and in-country production of steel.
Yeah, well, think about it as a supply chain. Why are you shipping it all the way over there, then shipping it all the way back? And if we think about not just metals, but glass, for instance, if there was a regional solution to recycling glass so that, bottle makers in the Northwest or bottle makers in the Southeast could, rely on a less expensive and environmentally responsible source of materials instead of just going and buying glass wherever they can get it. And consumers are aware of the fact that they use this material, so they see it as a benefit. This all ends up being a virtuous cycle of consumers saying, I want this to be recycled. Companies saying, okay, we'll take the responsibility and we'll even provide some accountability telling you where it went and how we used it. And so, the scrap metal industry did actually export far more material last year than we would have expected. So China at the beginning of 2018 banned most of the imports that they took: metals, plastics, glass, paper, and other. And yet, last year, ferrous metal exports increased by 24%, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. So instead of sending it to China, we send it to Vietnam and to Malaysia and India and the Philippines, amongst other places. And they're buying it because they're going to be able to build their next generation of bridges or their next generation of commercial products with this stuff. And we're going to go back and pay the more expensive, we're going to take the more expensive route and buy virgin materials. That's ridiculous.
Right. It is ridiculous. Especially when you think, there's so many infrastructure, critical infrastructure projects in this country that, are sort of waiting because they're very expensive. I mean, anything we can do to reduce the price of building, bridges and buildings should be looked at.
And just thinking in terms of security, if we couldn't get this stuff, where would we go? In many cases, we're also buying the raw materials from overseas as well. There's not a lot of iron mining going on in the United States anymore. So you need to think systemically and think beyond where we are today in terms of now people are saying glass is no longer recyclable. No, it's completely recyclable.
It's absolutely recyclable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess the other piece that gets me on the glass and gets me on all the recycling, I know in our area, and I think this is pretty commonplace, the goal is to be able to do the recycling at great if you can make a little bit of a profit, but as close to zero cost as possible. And I think that drives a lot of the decisions. But, we don't have that same pressure on our garbage system. I mean, nobody expenses your garbage system. I mean, garbage is a cost. It's a social cost that we do for health and welfare. And I'm not quite sure why recycling isn't also seen as such a strong social benefit that it's worth an investment.
I agree. And at the same time, we could lower the total waste that the garbage system manages, therefore lowering our cost of managing the garbage, and put more of that savings back to work in recycling. Because like many things in life, you have to subsidize an industry you may need to subsidize an industry until it achieves scale. And a lot of these businesses are just starting to experiment with scale. And you got to remember, we only started serious recycling in this country 35 years ago. So, while there were some forward-looking companies that started recycling back in the 19-teens and 20s, recognizing that there were markets for scrap metal and rubber and things like that, we're taking baby steps every day instead of strides into the future. Let's shift to the other part of this, and that's safety. We were talking about broken glass earlier. I heard some really terrible stories when I was at the ISRI conference, particularly in the session about the sorting facilities called MRFs, Materials Recovery Facilities. And in one case, a guy stood up and talked about the fact that two of his young workers, so young men, early 20s, were jabbed with sharps, medical sharps. And as a result, were no longer able to have unprotected relations with their spouses. And that had disrupted their plans to have children, that it had, in one of the cases, they had been disabled for a while because they were cut very badly. And we have to think about that. And so if you're pouring a bunch of broken glass into your recycling, that's going to hurt somebody, and you need to keep that in mind, just as you need to handle sharps effectively.
This is actually a really interesting conundrum, because I have seen, I think this is true across the entire country, but certainly on the West Coast, we have a heroin epidemic. And you do occasionally see a needle, an injection needle on the street. And I'm never quite sure what to do with it. I mean, what I have done is I've sort of kicked it to the curb or someplace where someone won't step on it. I have not picked them up, and I have not placed them in the trash can. Although that was my initial impulse was I can pick it up safely on the side. I can pick it up safely and put it in the trash. But I didn't, because I thought, well, when we had a diabetic cat for a while, and we had sharps containers that all of our sharps went into before they went into the garbage. And I thought, I can't just put a loose hypodermic needle into the trash can.
And
so,
that's,
it's sort of
the problem we have to think about every day.
Yeah.
I'm
not sure what you do.
My kids love to pick up trash, and recently we were in Boston, and they collected a big bag of trash. And when they were giving it to me, they were kind of going through it, and I saw there was a syringe in there, and I just freaked out because they didn't even have gloves on. But it turned out that there wasn't a needle attached, so there shouldn't. But it's even kind of scary thinking about those things, just, kids wanting to pick up trash and beautify a place. There's, some sort of health risk involved, given sharps.
Yeah. And sharps are just one of the things that or needles are just one of the sharps that you need to be concerned with. The scalpels from medical waste are something that could hurt somebody if they're not packaged correctly. If you're a diabetic at home and you've got a pump, components of the pump may be dangerous to somebody as well, not only because of the sharpness, but because of some form of infection. If you have hepatitis, for instance, that is something you need to be thinking about when you're throwing out the waste associated with the diabetic treatment. So we live in complicated times. We need to think about slightly more complicated issues and find simpler solutions to them, which, again, comes back to somebody has to be able to make a living to doing that.
Right.
There is always an economic imperative.
I was just going to say one thing that adds so much complexity to recycling and a lot of these commodity issues is just globalization, too, how it's kind of funny to think about recyclables on a global scale, but there's so much trade and shipping and different infrastructure in different countries, and it just becomes mind-bogglingly complex.
Which is why something like the IRSI conference and the guidance they provide within the industry and to consumers is really helpful. But one of the other things they did at this year's conference was recognize, they give a Design for Recycling award every year, and they gave Nestle Waters of North America a design award for their Nestle Pure Life 700 milliliter bottle, which is made from 100% recycled PET plastic. And, well, there's a lot of other issues with Nestle. At least they're making this kind of an investment in using the recycled materials. And the question is, are they also giving you a way to recycle it at the end of life so those PETs end up in another bottle? And so Nestle designed with that full life cycle in mind, and IRSI recognizing that is honoring them. And we need to call out more of those great product designs. Even when they use plastic, if that plastic is recycled and can be recycled, we're doing something better than pulling out petrochemicals to build or to make more. And so I think there's some really powerful things that the industry can do to encourage, but we also cannot allow them simply to self-regulate, because we know that ultimately at the end of the day, their interests will potentially overwhelm the interests of the community. So this is also an ongoing political dialogue, as I know you know, Evelyn, from all your years in public service.
Yeah, and I would have to say, all three of us are from states that put a very high value on environmental issues. So there haven't been as many big battles as you might see in some other places that are, I would say maybe a little bit more politically conservative. So this state, Washington State, has done a very good job, I think, of at least looking at what regulations it can put in place to try to restrict the flow of materials. But I'll say this: we have the habit of really going for the easy wins. So they were looking this legislative session, and I didn't notice whether it passed or not. They were looking this session at doing a statewide ban on plastic bags. Now, many of our municipalities, Seattle, Tacoma, Olympia, other places around the state have banned plastic shopping bags, and they were looking to take it statewide, which is good in many ways. But that sort of activity is not actually a significant driver of a lot of environmental waste. It would be equally good to do some additional thing. I mean, that's great, and it's good to do, and I'm glad they're looking at it. But I think we tend to say we've done something good, so we'll pat ourselves on the back and move on. And instead, it's like, well, now that you've done that one good thing, we're going to still have a list of other good things you can do. And one of the things, and this Nestle bottle is a good example, they seem to have done this somewhat voluntarily, which is very admirable. But, you could have government saying, if you're going to sell this or produce this item in our state, we are mandating that you use X percent, let's say 30%, 20% of recycled material in your packaging, in your product. Because as soon as it's required, and I think Trey Granger had said this previously on these podcasts, once it's required, you will see the industry shift around to meet that need. But until it is required, obviously a business is going to go with their best cost option.
Yeah, the other thing is that in addition to regulation, simple transparency providing people the information about what happened to the things that they have used is the next step for a lot of brands in terms of being responsible, taking the responsibility that Nestle did with the bottle, for instance. We're going to get 100% recycled material, but let's tell people where stuff is coming from and where it will be going when we're done with it. And that, again, brings the consumer, who is the person who is really driving the complexity of this process by either sorting carefully or dumping everything in the bin. They get engaged in this, and what we need to find is ways to signal back that your recycling is a success. That also then drives more companies to join in, and this is where consumers can have a real impact on what strategies companies take to deliver the stuff they buy.
I think policies are a great idea, but I think they could potentially be limiting to kind of out of the box thinking, because it's great to use post-consumer recycled materials, but other options would be if there are ways to make packaging out of waste products or just dramatically reduce the materials and the weight used in packaging. And I think there's a lot of different potential approaches to more sustainable packaging.
Yeah, I think.
By the way,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, Maine just passed a law to ban styrofoam containers on a statewide basis for food.
Oh, that's excellent.
That's progress. Yeah, so one of the things we can also do in addition to regulation is creating incentives. And so to your idea of 20 or 30% recycled materials, Evelyn, maybe if you incented somebody to use materials that were within the state, that's the other way to think about it. So not only are you looking for recycled, but you're looking for locally recycled. And then you're creating jobs within the state to do the work that may have been shipped overseas, as we know is already happening right now, or to another state. So, maybe you give back a penny on a bottle that is made with a locally sourced recycled material to the manufacturer. That would be another way to think about incenting this. But it comes down to how we price it for the consumer.
Right. Sarah, does Maine have deposits on bottles the way some states do?
Yeah, we do. I think it's only a nickel, though. So it is mildly helpful, but I don't think it's keeping up with inflation.
Yeah. So I don't know why.
It's enough to inspire my 8-year-old to collect bottles.
Well, and in some areas, I know people who are homeless or who are, borderline homeless do make some extra income by going out in the evenings and picking up cans and bottles. And that's, kind of not a bad side economy. Not a great side economy, but it's not a bad way of getting some cash out to people.
It's limited cash right now. We need to figure out how to make more cash available to pay those people to do that work.
Yeah,
absolutely. In my town, Belfast, Maine, we just had a cleanup day last weekend to clean up trash on the sides of the roads and in town and such. And on my road, we picked up just dozens and dozens of glass bottles. So it seems like people are just chucking them out of their cars while they're driving. I don't know if that's because of open container laws or what, but it seems like the nickel isn't enough to incentivize people. I was amazed. I walked it was an eighth of a mile to the corner and back on my road and collected probably about 30 glass bottles. A lot of them you couldn't see. They were kind of in the ditch and such, but it's amazing how many are being thrown out of cars.
That's a lot.
Well, that's just a jerk move, regardless of the incentives in place. Don't throw stuff out of the window of your car. Just don't do it.
Yeah.
And glass seems especially bad.
Well, kids are walking along the side of the road. And I see the same thing here. It's unfortunate that there is a carelessness about not only the environment, but other people. Back to the sharps that we were talking about before, too. It's because somebody leaves it there. It's not; these things don't just appear out of nature. It's human activity.
That's true. Very true. Very true. Before we get to Earthling questions, I did want to make a mention of an article that Sarah has up on the website on sustainable smartphones, because I think that sort of, plays into this idea of, not only manufacturers using better materials, but also, whether some phones are a little bit more fixable and repairable, since most of them are not.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you've heard of iFixit.com, but they have a repairability score that they'll give to some electronics. And so I went on there, and unfortunately, most cell phones have a very low repairability score. But there are some that are, it's a 10-point scale, and most of the cell phones that I've ever owned got about a 3 or a 4 and seem quite complicated just to even remove the faceplate or basic things like that. But some of them do have a higher score, like more in the 6 range. So there are more repairable cell phones out there. One thing that I found interesting that I realized while writing the article is that because people tend to replace their cell phones every year or two, that it's largely the manufacturing process that's the most polluting, not so much charging it. So being, basically making a more aware purchase is a great way to get started to reduce our impact.
Yeah, so look at the manufacturers' carbon footprints, and unfortunately not a lot of this stuff is available, but it's coming along. We work with CSR Hub, which provides some of that information, but it's not standard operating procedure for a company to share the amount of pollution they create as they make something, and certainly they don't pay attention to many don't pay attention to what the consequences for the environment of their waste is. But the other thing on the phones that's interesting, and you mentioned it, we're replacing our phones every 12 to 18 months. And that is the basis of a circular economy, if you can afford it. And that's also a problem. But again, it's so complex. If you decide you trust a phone manufacturer, and let's just take Apple as an example, they make very credible green claims across parts of their manufacturing systems, but not all. If I decide,
they got a pretty high score from Greenpeace in their Guide to Greener Electronics.
Right, but if I say, Apple, look, I'll buy phones from you for the next 10 years, as long as I know they're made with recycled materials and you're going to recycle them every 18 months when I send my phone back. Apple then has the ability to plan its inventory or the demand for the period of time that we agreed on. It lowers their costs. It also makes us confident about the use of the material being circular. It's the beginning of a world in which we call it subscription, but where we're paying a monthly fee for something, and instead of buying a product that is our responsibility to take away later, the manufacturer is taking on the responsibility of getting it back, refurbishing it, moving it down market to somebody who couldn't afford the phone in the first place but may 2 years later, and reusing the materials if they have to recycle. And that's, as much as we would like to get to a big green circular economy right away, there are economic, particularly equity issues that we have to address as we start to price things this way. And that's a big change that we're in the midst of as well.
Yeah, and I think if they design products accordingly, it could potentially be more profitable for them. Like Xerox Europe designed a lot of products with the same parts, like the same paper tray and things like that. So they would actually remanufacture their printers and their copiers using a lot of standard parts. I don't know if for a cell phone, if that would work, just because the technology is evolving so quickly, but possibly in a decade, I would imagine things are going to slow down and it might be more possible to use such a model.
Well, things will become standardized. And the funny thing is what you just described is the Ford approach to lowering the cost of making a car 120 years ago, too. They standardized parts so that you could take one part from one car and put it in another. Of course, they only made one car for a long time. But that was also how the PC industry grew up, the Windows clone business, for those of you who remember what a Windows clone was. But it was the fact that you could take a SCSI from one system and put it into another system, that's a kind of communications bus, made those products less expensive overall, as well as made it easy to repair or to build your own. And we're simply at a point right now where there's so much complexity, and so the race for more technology is accelerating. But there's going to be a point where we normalize and can standardize these materials again, and we may want to as a way of lowering the environmental impact. So again, there'll be a trade-off involved in that. And it's understanding and thinking about those trade-offs every day that we need to do as consumers when we look at the various options we have to buy something or to lease something, and to hold somebody accountable for what happens to that material when we're done with it.
Yeah, and going along those same lines, modular design makes a lot of sense. The Fairphone 2, which is a smartphone, uses that design. So let's say, because a lot of times my friends might say to me after they've had a phone for a year or two, I think I'm going to get a new phone. And I'll say, oh, I thought it was working just fine. And they'll say, oh, well, I want a better camera. So maybe everything's great, but there's this one thing that they'd like to upgrade. So then they have to replace the entire phone. But with modular design, then you could just swap out the camera only and keep the rest of the phone.
And that's the kind of mix and match world that a truly standards-based economy can facilitate. We are in an era of irrational intellectual property protection in many cases.
And I also find it strange how little responsibility is put on corporations and how much responsibility is put on municipalities from a waste standpoint. Kind of getting back to the recycling conversation we were having earlier, it ends up being, cities and towns that pay waste disposal costs, but it's the companies that created these products to begin with. So, and they're the ones that are making things so complex to recycle. There's just not an incentive for them to make it easier to recycle these products. But if the responsibility was on them, then I bet there would be a very different product packaging design as a result.
Well, let's take Amazon as an example. Amazon's just becoming susceptible to local sales taxes after a 20-year hiatus. It was granted to them by law. Now that they're being held responsible for sales in local regions, they could also be held responsible for the waste they create. And so there are ways to think about combining sales tax and a recycling tax on companies that aren't actually part of your community. And I think that's one of the problems that companies have today is they are so separate and perceived as being almost transnational and indifferent to the plight of their everyday customer or their employees. And by moving back to a participatory role in the local economy where your customers live and work and feed themselves and make buying decisions, knowing that you could say, look, we're going to take it all back. We're going to continue to lower the packaging footprint so that we can lower the environmental impact on your community. All of these things are part of a political discussion that companies have not wanted to participate in because they've taken a libertarian hands-off approach that allows them to ignore the consequences of their actions. And we need to have them at least recognize those consequences because we all have to live with them.
Very true.
Yeah,
and on that note,
it's somewhat different in Europe too. I was just saying that in Europe there is more producer responsibility.
Yeah, and it's not that we're all following Europe, but Europe is one of several examples of ways that modern economies are starting to come to grips with this. But again, like I said earlier, it's all baby steps. It's also not reasonable to think we would have all the solutions because we are in the midst of this. And that's why getting people involved, sharing ideas, and getting them to express their preferences, particularly for recycling and accountability, are going to be powerful levers in the marketplace.
Let's turn to our Earthling questions. So our first question comes from Eunice on Facebook, and this I think is quite interesting. She says, how can I recycle an air mattress, an aerobed? So Mitch, what do you think? What can you do about a air mattress?
Well, so air mattresses are dicey. A lot of air mattresses in the in the old day were made from PVC or plastic number 3, which is not, because of the way that they're made, particularly recyclable. If you have an airbed with a kind of a velour cover, for instance, you've got a mixed material that needs to be separated. And in most cases, that separation isn't economically viable right now. So, but if you have a newer non-PVC based air mattress, those are generally recyclable. So look for a plastic number, and if you see number 3, that probably is not going to be accepted in most locations. You'll need to take it to a household landfill. And you can also search on search.earth911.com for locations that will accept it, but you're going to need to call ahead because, again, if it's a mixed material, there's going to be very little interest in recycling it.
Yeah. Well, I thought, too, I took a look at the link on the Earth911 website, Living Well. It's air mattress, recycle or reuse. And that had some really good information. I mean, it really depends on what type of air mattress you're talking about. Although this AeroBed, I think, is one of those that has both sort of a fabric and the plastic. But some of the other ideas were, ways to reuse it for different things, like covering up your outdoor furniture or your barbecue, or using it as a ground cover when you're painting. So, if you can't recycle it, think about whether
get out a razor and cut it out
some way. Yeah.
And that also is obviously one of the things we tend to focus on recycling, but reuse is the most efficient way to make something less carbon impactful.
Mm-hmm. So our next question, Kim from Pasadena wants to know, it's kind of a similar thing. Can a rubber-backed doormat be recycled?
Well, so this is roughly the same answer. If it's a rubber-backed doormat with a rubber top, it's pretty recyclable. Rubber is recyclable, and if all else fails, can be ground up to be used in, for instance, asphalt. On the other hand, if you've got a rubber-backed, let's say, I can't think of what the material is, but you can wipe your feet on the
right.
rattan or something like that.
Right.
That is not going to be easily recycled because the two materials are not can't be separated very easily, particularly the rubber from the matting material. So the general answer is no, but an all rubber mat can be recycled, and you should call your household waste facility to see if they will take it. Certainly the database will tell you which ones do, but it's always good to call ahead.
Yeah, and I was trying to think of things that you could reuse a rubber doormat for, and there's probably some garden use. There might be some use of cutting it up, to make some, things to go under heavy furniture. But I think
or move it from the front door to the back door and use it as
front door to the back door.
Yeah,
absolutely. But yeah, that one I think is unlikely to be recyclable. And this is a last one. It's kind of interesting. Amy from Marlborough, New York asks, she says, hey, I'm an artist trying to make my work as environmentally friendly as possible. I am making my own recycled paper by turning junk mail, newspaper, etc. into pulp and creating new paper. I then form the new paper into sculptures. My question is, can these sculptures then be recycled? If I put them in a bin, will they be processed and recycled or discarded? They're not large or thick. It's about the consistency of paper egg carton. And she really hopes that they can be recycled because she doesn't want to create waste.
Well, she's not creating waste. Congratulations, Amy.
Oh, she is recycling. Yeah, no, I would say...
She's recycling simply by creating the art.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, I think if you pound it down to a pulp, kind of like a paper mache, I think I would, if I had this, I would probably contact my recycling people and ask them, because I know for my recycling,
if you're using the paper mache, the material, yes, you're right, because there's a mix that people use that in some kinds plaster or some kind of rubbery material. I can't remember what it is, but she's describing just paper that she's pressed or molded into other forms. So this is not a paper mache. Paper mache you do need to be careful about.
Right. But she also mentions that it's like egg carton. And in my recycling, egg cartons do not go into, I don't put my egg cartons in the mix. I take them to the recycling center where there's a separate area for egg cartons. So that makes me think you might want to double check.
Location. Yeah, there's a drop-off location option that she should definitely consider when she's getting rid of them. But of course, it's art. Why do you get rid of them? Give them to a friend.
I agree. Well, and the other thing is that even if for some reason it's not recyclable, my guess is in New York it probably is, this is beautifully compostable if it's sort of mulched up the paper and has turned it into art. So there may be all kinds of really interesting organic ways that this can, evolve and dissolve out in the yard too.
Yeah, although a point, if you're using junk mail, you want to make sure that you're using uncoated paper.
Okay.
Right. So you want to pick the newsprint or the paperboard, but not the treated papers when you're doing that. But otherwise, again, this is a remarkably sustainable form of art. It can be composted. It probably can be recycled in most locations. It in of itself is making a longer life of the paper that you receive in the mail. So good job, Amy.
Excellent job. And it's very interesting, too. So before we go off, I just wanted to do a mention. You have done a couple of recent interviews that were quite interesting, Mitch.
Yeah.
Do you want to mention them? We've got one with Dr. Katrina Cornish on the future of rubber production. What was that about?
Well, so Dr. Cornish is working with the American Sustainable Rubber Company at the Ohio State University to create rubber from a dandelion that she genetically modified. And it's a fascinating discussion because we import all the rubber we use in the United States from Malaysian and Southeast Asian rubber plantations, which is a vast monoculture. What I learned on this call that was particularly intriguing to me is that there are 2,600 plants in the world that make rubber. But we domesticated only one of them. And so Dr. Cornish and her team are extracting rubber that can be used just like regular rubber in tires and sporting goods. In fact, she wants the first product that they make to be a sporting good, like a basketball that's sustainable. It's extracted from dandelions grown indoors in vertical farms. So they can do up to 3 harvests a year. And this is potentially a way of offsetting some or eventually all of that $1.6 billion worth of rubber that we are importing from plantations that could be wiped out by a drought or a blight in weeks. Yeah. So as a way of material security, this is a great thing for us to be looking at. And I also, another interview that I really thought was a lot of fun and learned a lot from was with Adam Lowry, who is the CEO and co-founder of Ripple Foods. And Adam and his partner have created dairy-free milks from a variety of plants, but particularly peas. And these milks are substantially less water-intensive than almond and other milks that you might be buying as alternatives to dairy. Coconut milk, for instance. Both of those require thousands of gallons to fill just one container. Peas require 1/10 the amount of water to produce. So it's a really interesting undertaking. And Adam's background includes creating Method, the green household cleaners company. So we're seeing second-generation investments by people who have started sustainability businesses.
So interesting. Yeah, I will definitely listen to those. Well, that's all we have for this episode. We are always in. But that's it. I know, but I think we covered a lot, don't you?
Absolutely. I was joking about at all.
I know. So much information. Well, we're always interested in hearing from people, especially if they have recycling questions or suggestions. You can always email us at feedback@earth911.com and listen to us on all of your regular platforms. And we will see you next time.
Take care, everybody.